The wind across the Montana Territory in December of 1887 did not merely blow, it hunted. It stripped warmth from the air and drove snow into hard, stinging pellets that scoured the pine trees down to bare wood. The temperature had plunged to 20 degrees below zero, and the world had become a place of white silence and blue shadows where a man could die in an hour if he lost his way. Jacob Cordell pulled the buffalo hide coat tighter around his massive frame, though it did little to stop the cold from finding the spaces between the fur and his neck. He was a mountain of a man, 6'3", with shoulders built from 43 years of hard living. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with silver like frost on iron, and it hung down to the middle of his chest. His hair, equally long, was tied back with a strip of leather, and a scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, a gift from a Sioux tomahawk in 1873. He moved through the forest with the ease of a man who had spent more time among trees than among people. His boots, handmade from moose hide, left deep prints in the snow as he checked his trap line along Frozen Creek. The traps were New House No. 4 leg-hold traps, the best money could buy, and they cost him $4 each from the trading post in Timber Ridge. Jacob carried a Sharps 50 caliber 90-grain rifle across his back, the weapon slung on a leather strap he had made himself. The gun was old, a relic from his Army days, but it could drop a grizzly bear at 300 yards. On his hip hung a Colt .45 revolver, and in his belt was a Bowie knife with a 10-inch blade that his father had forged by hand. He was alone. He had been alone for 11 years. The cabin where he lived sat at the summit of Eagle's Crest, a peak that rose 7,000 feet above the valley floor. It was 2 miles from the nearest human habitation, which was his father's cabin, and 15 miles from the town of Timber Ridge. In winter, when the snow came, Jacob could go months without seeing another soul. He preferred it that way. The memories lived in his cabin like unwelcome guests. Martha, his wife, with her dark hair and quick laugh. Caleb, his son, 9 years old, who loved to whittle animals from pine wood. They had died in the autumn of 1876, taken by diphtheria within 3 days of each other. Jacob had buried them on the ridge behind the cabin, under 2 pine trees that stood like sentinels against the sky. He had not been back to their graves in 5 years. As Jacob moved along the trap line, his breath came out in white clouds that vanished instantly in the wind. He was thinking about nothing in particular, his mind empty the way a mountain man's mind becomes empty after years of solitude when he saw the blood. It was bright red against the white snow, a splash of color that stood out like a wound. Jacob stopped. He knelt down, touched the snow with his bare hand, brought his fingers to his nose. Human blood. Fresh. 2 hours old, maybe 3. The trail led away from the creek, heading south toward the timber line. Jacob stood slowly, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle. He followed the blood. The tracks told a story. A woman's boots, size 6, with narrow heels that sank deep into the snow. She was dragging her left leg. The blood came from that leg, painting a line through the white like a brushstroke. She was moving slowly, staggering, and from the depth of the prints, Jacob could tell she was exhausted. He found the rosary beads first. They were tangled in a thorn bush, dark red wood beads on a silver chain, frozen solid. Jacob picked them up. Catholic. A nun's rosary. What in hell was a nun doing up here? He followed the trail for another half-mile. The blood was getting thicker now, more frequent. The woman was dying. If she had not already frozen to death, she would within the hour. Jacob found her in a hollow beneath a hemlock tree, curled into a tight ball like a child. She wore the full black habit of the Sisters of Charity, the long dress soaked through with snow and blood. Her white wimple, the cloth that covered her neck, was torn on one side and her black veil hung askew, revealing dark red hair plastered to her skull. She was not moving. Jacob dropped to one knee beside her. He pulled off his glove and pressed 2 fingers against her neck. The skin was terrifyingly cold, like touching marble left out in a root cellar, but there was a pulse, faint, thready, barely there. She was alive. The realization hit Jacob like a physical blow. He had not saved anyone in 11 years. He had not wanted to save anyone. He had chosen the mountain specifically because there was no one here to save, no one to disappoint, no one to bury. But now this woman, this nun, lay dying in the snow at his feet. Jacob shifted his position, preparing to lift her. The moment his hands touched her shoulders, she flinched. It was a violent jerking motion, her body reacting even though she was unconscious. A small, ragged sound tore from her throat, not quite a scream, but a whimper of pure animal terror. Her eyes did not open. Jacob hesitated. He looked down at her face. She was young, perhaps 28 or 29 years old, with delicate features and a bruise darkening her left cheekbone. There were more bruises on her throat, purple fingerprints where someone had grabbed her. Someone had hurt this woman, badly. Jacob made his decision. He stripped off his buffalo coat and wrapped it around her, then lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as if the cold had already hollowed her out. He carried her back to where he had left his hand sled, a contraption of ash wood and rope that he used to haul his traps and gear. He laid her on the sled as gently as he could, then covered her with a bearskin blanket. He tied the rope to his belt and began the long walk back to his cabin. The wind picked up as he walked, and the snow began to fall harder. Jacob bent his head against it and pulled. The sled scraped over the frozen ground behind him, and with every step he wondered what he was doing, why he was risking his own life for a stranger. But he kept walking. Behind him, far back in the trees where the shadows grew thick, two men on horseback watched through the falling snow. They were too far away for Jacob to see, but they were there, watching, waiting. One of them raised a spyglass to his eye. The cabin appeared through the snow like a ghost materializing from fog. It was a single-room structure made of pine logs, 20 feet by 20 feet, with a stone chimney at one end and a small barn attached to the side. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin gray line that Jacob had left burning that morning before he went out. He dragged the sled up to the door, untied the rope, and carried the woman inside. The cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the faint scent of dried herbs that hung from the rafters. There was a bed in one corner, a simple frame with a corn husk mattress and wool blankets. A wooden table and two chairs occupied the center of the room. On the wall hung a Winchester rifle, a shotgun, and a photograph in a wooden frame. The photograph showed a woman and a boy, Martha and Caleb. Jacob had not looked at it in 3 years. He carried the nun to the bed and laid her down. Then he turned to the fire and built it up until the flames roared and the iron stove beside it ticked with heat. He filled a kettle with water and set it on the stove to boil. Jacob had learned field medicine during his years as an Army Scout. He knew how to set bones, stitch wounds, and treat frostbite. He had saved men who had been shot, stabbed, and trampled by horses. But he had not been able to save Martha and Caleb. He pushed the thought away. The nun's clothes were soaked through. Jacob knew he had to get them off her or she would die of hypothermia. He hesitated, his hands hovering over the buttons of her habit. This was a bride of Christ, a woman who had taken vows, but she was dying. "Forgive me, ma'am," Jacob muttered to the empty room. He unbuttoned the black habit and peeled it away. Beneath it she wore a simple white chemise, and beneath that he could see more bruises. Dark purple marks on her ribs, yellow bruises on her collarbone. Someone had beaten this woman. Jacob's jaw tightened. He removed her boots. They were cheap, thin-soled, completely unsuited for the mountain. Then he saw the blood. It had soaked through the heavy black stockings on her right leg, drying into a stiff, dark crust. Jacob took his knife and carefully cut the stocking away. The wound was ugly. A deep, jagged gash ran along the outside of her thigh, perhaps 5 inches long. It looked like she had caught it on barbed wire or a sharp branch while running in the dark. The edges were angry and red, and the flesh was torn deep, down to the muscle. The wound was infected. He could see the early signs, the swelling, the heat radiating from the skin. Jacob looked at her face. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and fast. "I am no doctor," Jacob said quietly, "but if I leave that, the fever will take you before sunrise." He moved to the stove. He filled a basin with the boiling water and set it aside to cool slightly. He took a strip of clean white cotton from an old flour sack and tore it into bandages. Then he went to the small tin box on the mantel where he kept his medical supplies. Inside was a curved needle, number 3, the kind used for stitching, canvas, and heavy leather. There was a spool of catgut thread, strong and thin. There was a bottle of whiskey for sterilization. And there were packets of dried herbs, willow bark for pain, yarrow for stopping blood, echinacea for infection. Jacob dropped the needle into the boiling water and watched it rattle against the tin bottom. When he turned back, her eyes were open. They were green, the color of pine needles in summer, and they were wide with terror. She was pushing herself up on her elbows, scrambling backward on the bed, pressing herself against the rough log wall. "No," she rasped. Her voice was a broken whisper. "No, no, no." Jacob froze. He still held the needle in his hand, pinched between his thumb and forefinger. The woman stared at the needle. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were almost entirely black. The sight of the metal seemed to unlock something inside her, a memory so visceral it overrode everything else. "Not the needle," she whispered. "Please, not again." Jacob slowly lowered his hand. He placed the needle on the table behind him, out of her sight. Then he sat down on the floor, making himself smaller, less threatening. "Sister," he said, his voice low and steady, the way he used to speak to spooked horses. "You are safe. This is my cabin. My name is Jacob Cordell. I found you in the snow." She looked around wildly, her chest heaving. Her gaze darted to the door, then to the window dark with night. "I have to leave," she said, trying to swing her legs off the bed. The movement pulled at the gash on her leg, and she gasped, squeezing her eyes shut as pain hit her. "You are not going anywhere," Jacob said firmly. "You are half frozen and you are hurt bad. That cut on your leg needs stitching, or you will bleed out." "I cannot be here," she insisted. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, and her fear spiked. To her, he was just a large, looming shape in the dim light, a bearded mountain man with scarred hands and a gun belt hanging on the chair. "What is your name?" Jacob asked gently. She clamped her mouth shut. Her jaw trembled. "All right," he said. "No name then, but you have a cut on your leg that needs tending." He walked to the stove and used a pair of tongs to fish the needle out of the boiling water. He set it on a clean cloth. He poured some of the hot water into a bowl and added a splash of whiskey. When he turned back to the bed, holding the needle and thread, the woman went rigid. She stared at the needle in his hand, and suddenly she was not in the cabin anymore. She was somewhere else. Somewhere dark, and the needle meant something terrible. "No," she whispered. Jacob stepped closer. "I have to stitch it up, miss. It is deep." She scrambled back until she hit the wall, trapping herself. Her breathing turned into ragged, hyperventilating gasps. She looked from his face to the needle, her mind clearly not in this room anymore, but back in whatever hell she had run from. "Please," she begged. "It will only take a minute," Jacob said gently. He reached for her ankle to steady her leg, and then she screamed. It was a raw, terrifying sound that seemed to tear her throat. She kicked out at him, scrambling away, her hands clawing at the blanket. "You want to put it in?" she shrieked. Jacob froze. The words hung in the air, vibrating with a horror he did not understand. She was not talking about the needle for stitching. He could see it in the way she curled in on herself, protecting her body. Her eyes squeezed shut to block out a nightmare. The phrase was specific. It was a plea he was never meant to hear, a desperate beg from a moment of violence. "You want to put it in?" she screamed again, sobbing the words. "Please, not again. I cannot take it. Do not put it in." Jacob stood perfectly still. The needle was pinched between his thumb and forefinger. He felt a cold sensation wash over him that had nothing to do with the winter draft seeping through the cabin walls. He understood now. The bruises, the terror of men, the way she had flinched when he touched her. He lowered his hand slowly, placing the needle and thread on the table behind him, out of her sight. He kept his palms open and visible. "Miss," he said quietly. She was rocking back and forth, plummeting into her knees. "Look at me," Jacob commanded, though he kept his voice soft. She did not look. "I am not him," Jacob said. The sobbing hitched. "I am not the man who hurt you," he said. "I am just a man with a needle trying to close a cut so you do not bleed out. That is all I am putting anywhere." She lifted her head slowly. Her face was wet with tears, her expression shattered. She looked at his hands. They were empty. "I am asking," Jacob said, meeting her gaze with a steadiness he did not feel. "I am not taking. If you say no, I will walk out that door and let you be. But you will likely lose that leg." Maybe your life. She stared at him, her chest rising and falling in jerky rhythms. The silence stretched out, filled only by the pop of the firewood in the hearth. She looked at the wound on her leg, then back at his face. She was searching for a lie in his eyes. Do it, she whispered finally. Her voice was so faint he almost missed it. Jacob nodded once. He pulled the wooden chair over to the side of the bed and sat down. He picked up the needle again. I am going to clean it first, he said. It will sting. She gripped the edges of the bed until her knuckles turned white. Jacob worked with grim care. He washed the wound with the whiskey water, his hands moving efficiently, the way they had moved 1,000 times before on injured soldiers. She hissed through her teeth, but did not pull away. Then came the stitching. He had sewn up horses and cattle. He had sewn up his own arm once after a knife slipped while he was skinning a deer. But this was different. Her skin was pale and shivering. He had to lean close, his head bent near her thigh to see in the lantern light. The intimacy of it was overwhelming. He could feel the heat of her skin radiating against his hand. He could smell the scent of her, sweat and fear, and the faint, lingering perfume of lavender soap that belonged to a life far from this cabin. Every time the needle pierced her skin, she flinched. Sorry, he murmured. He stopped whenever she began to shake too hard, waiting for her to settle. He let her set the pace. He did not hold her leg down. He rested his hand on her shin, a grounding weight, ready to lift if she panicked. 1 stitch, 2 stitches, 3. His jaw was clenched so hard that his teeth ached. He focused entirely on the task, pretending that the closeness meant nothing, pretending that the way her breath hitched every time his hand grazed her skin did not make his own heart hammer against his ribs. There, he said finally, tying off the thread and cutting it with the knife. It is done. He wrapped the wound in the clean cotton strips, then stood up and stepped back, putting distance between them. The woman slumped against the pillow, exhausted. She turned her face to the wall and began to weep. It was not the frantic screaming of before. It was a quiet, desolate sobbing born of pain and a shame Jacob could not begin to measure. She cried for the exposure, for the helplessness, for the memory of whatever had happened before she found herself in the snow. Jacob stood by the table, gathering the bloody rags into the basin. He felt like an intruder in his own home. He knew with a certainty born of his own scars that she could not bear a man's touch right now, no matter how kind. Rest, he said gruffly. He took the basin outside to dump the bloody water. The wind hit him, cold and clean, scrubbing the smell of the sick room from his nose. He stood on the porch for a long moment, breathing in the icy air, trying to slow his own pulse. When he went back inside, she was quiet. She had pulled the blanket up to her chin, her eyes closed, though he knew she was not asleep. The air in the cabin had changed. It was no longer just a shelter. It was charged, frightened, and dangerously alive. Jacob moved to the small kitchen area and began to make coffee. He needed something to do with his hands. He ground the beans in a hand mill, the sound loud in the silence. He filled the pot with water and set it on the stove. He was pouring the first cup when she spoke. Why did you save me? Her voice was hoarse but steady. Jacob turned. She was sitting up now, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl. Her red hair hung in damp waves around her face. Could not leave a dying woman in the snow, Jacob said simply. It is not how I was raised. Most men would have taken advantage. Jacob looked at her steadily. I am not most men, and you are hurt. That is all that matters. She was quiet for a moment, studying him. Who are you, Jacob Cordell? I live here. Alone, have for 11 years. Why? Lost my family, Jacob said. His voice was flat, emotionless. Wife and son, diphtheria. Buried them up on the ridge. Her expression softened. I am sorry. Jacob shrugged. It was a long time ago. She looked around the cabin, seeing it properly for the first time. She saw the photograph on the wall, the woman and boy. She saw the small toys still sitting on a shelf in the corner, a carved wooden horse, a spinning top. You kept their things, she said softly. Jacob did not answer. He poured a second cup of coffee and brought it to her. She took it with both hands, warming her fingers on the tin cup. What is your name? Jacob asked. She hesitated. Sister Margaret Rose. But you can call me Rose, Sister Rose, Jacob nodded. What were you running from, Sister Rose? She looked down into the coffee. If I tell you, you will be in danger. I am already in danger, Jacob said. The moment I brought you here, so you might as well tell me the truth. Rose was quiet for a long time. Then she began to speak. I come from St. Vincent's Orphanage in Timber Ridge. I am a nun with the Sisters of Charity. I took my perpetual vows 6 years ago. Jacob felt something cold settle in his stomach. Perpetual vows. That meant she was bound to the church forever. She could never marry, never have children. I work at the orphanage, Rose continued. We care for 24 children. Orphans, some abandoned, some whose parents died. One girl in particular, Lucy, she is 12 years old. She has consumption, tuberculosis. She calls me Mother Rose. Rose's voice broke slightly on the last words. She is the only child I will ever have, because I chose God over an earthly family. Jacob said nothing. He let her talk. The orphanage is run by Archbishop Cornelius Thorne. He controls the entire diocese. 18 parishes, 4 orphanages. He is powerful, wealthy, connected. Rose's hands tightened on the coffee cup. 10 years ago, when I was 19, my father died. Judge Thomas Sullivan. Thorne was just Father Thorne then. He came to the funeral. He proposed to me 3 days later. Jacob's eyebrows rose. I refused, Rose said. I told him I felt called to religious life. I wanted to serve God, not him. So I entered the convent, took my final vows at 23. What happened then? Thorne became archbishop 2 years after I took my vows. And he took control of our order, our convent, our orphanage. Rose looked up at Jacob, her green eyes fierce. He has been punishing me ever since. The other sisters, the ones who were young and pretty and defiant and like me, they started disappearing. 5 of them. In 4 years. Accidents, they said. Falls downstairs. Drownings. Sickness. But you do not believe that. Rose shook her head. I found something. A ledger. Red leather cover. Hidden in his office. The crimson ledger, we called it. What was in it? Everything, Rose's voice dropped to a whisper. Money he has stolen from the charity funds. $80,000 over 10 years. Names of people he has bribed. Sheriff Burns, Judge Mackenzie, the land commissioner. All of them bought and paid for. Jacob felt his jaw tighten. And there were notes, Rose continued, about the sisters who disappeared, where they were buried, how much he paid the men who did it. Jesus Christ, Jacob breathed. I tried to tell Mother Beatrice, our abbess. She told me to be silent. That Thorne would destroy the orphanage if I spoke. That Lucy and all the children would be thrown out into the streets. So what did you do? I was going to go to the federal marshal in Helena. I had copied some pages from the ledger. I hid them with Mother Beatrice. But Thorne found out. How? Someone told him. One of the other sisters, maybe, or he has spies everywhere. I do not know. But 3 days ago, he came to my cell at night. Rose's voice became very quiet. He had 2 men with him. They held me down. He said I was possessed by demons, that I needed to be exorcised. He had needles, morphine. He injected me. She closed her eyes. The memory was too vivid, too raw. When I woke up, my habit was torn. I was in pain. I knew what he had done, and I knew if I stayed, he would do it again. Or worse. So you ran. I ran, in the middle of a blizzard. I did not even know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I made it about 10 miles before I fell. I thought I was going to die out there. But you did not, Jacob said. No. Rose looked at him. You found me. They sat in silence for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the cabin. Jacob stood up and walked to the window. He pulled back the canvas curtain and looked out into the darkness. He could see nothing but snow and shadows, but he knew they were out there. The men who were hunting Rose. They would come. You can stay here as long as you need, Jacob said, turning back to her. No one knows about this cabin except my father, and he will not talk. Rose shook her head. You do not understand. Thorne will not stop. He has money. He has power. He will find me. And when he does, he will kill anyone who helped me. Then we will be ready, Jacob said simply. Why would you risk your life for me? Jacob looked at the photograph on the wall. Martha and Caleb, the family he had failed to save. Because I could not save them, he said quietly. But maybe I can save you. Rose stared at him, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a connection forged in shared pain. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob nodded. He handed her a wool blanket. "You sleep in the bed tonight. I will take the floor." He made a pallet near the fire, laying out a bear skin and a blanket. He placed his Winchester rifle beside him within easy reach. Then he sat down, his back against the wall, and waited for dawn. Rose lay in the bed watching him. She had spent the last 5 years sleeping in a cold stone cell in the convent, rising at 5 every morning for prayers, spending her days caring for sick children. She had taken vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. She had promised God her entire life. And now here she was, in a mountain cabin, with a man she did not know, wearing nothing but a thin chemise. Her habit lay in ruins on the floor. She should feel ashamed. She should feel guilty. But all she felt was safe. For the first time in 3 years, she felt safe. The night passed slowly. Jacob did not sleep. He sat with the rifle across his knees, listening to the wind, listening for the sound of horses or men. Every creak of the timber made him tighten his grip on the gun. Around 3 in the morning, Rose began to murmur in her sleep. She was having a nightmare. Jacob could hear her, the small, frightened sounds, the way she curled tighter into a ball. "No," she whispered. "Please, Mr. Thorne, no." The name hung in the cold air like a curse. Jacob looked toward the bed, his jaw set. He had seen evil men before. He had fought them in the war. But this kind of evil, the kind that hid behind a collar and a cross, the kind that preyed on women who had given their lives to God, that was a special kind of darkness. And Jacob Cordell had just decided that he would kill it. The dawn came slowly, gray and reluctant. The wind had died down, but the temperature had dropped even further. Jacob stood and stretched, his back aching from the hard floor. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. Rose woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She sat up slowly, wincing at the pain in her leg. Jacob had his back to her, cooking at the stove. "Good morning," he said without turning around. "Good morning. How is the leg?" "Sore, but better, thank you." Jacob brought her a plate of bacon and fried corn cakes. She ate hungrily, realizing she had not eaten in 3 days. As she ate, she watched him. He moved around the small cabin with an economy of motion, wasting nothing, efficient in everything. His hands were scarred and calloused, but surprisingly gentle. She noticed the way he avoided looking at the photograph on the wall. "You love them very much," she said quietly. Jacob paused. He did not turn around. "Yes. Do you think they would want you to live up here alone for the rest of your life?" Jacob was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I do not know what they would want. They are dead, and I am here." "You are here," Rose said. "But are you living?" Before Jacob could answer, they heard it. The sound of a horse moving fast through the snow. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. He pushed aside the curtain just enough to see out. A young man was riding up the trail on a spotted horse. He was maybe 18 years old, wearing a fur cap and a heavy coat. His name was Danny Tucker, and he trapped beaver on the north slope. Jacob opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Danny reined in his horse and dismounted. "Toby," Danny said. Jacob's friends called him Toby, a nickname from childhood that had stuck. "I was hoping you had some willow bark. My paw's got the rheumatism, something fierce." Jacob nodded. "I got some. Wait here." He went back inside, closing the door behind him. He gathered a bundle of dried willow bark from his stores and wrapped it in cloth. When he turned, Rose was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide. "Someone is here," she whispered. "Just a neighbor boy. He will not see you." But Jacob was wrong. As he handed the bundle to Danny through the door, the young man's eyes drifted past Jacob's shoulder. Through the gap in the door, he saw Rose. She was sitting on the bed, her red hair loose around her shoulders, wearing only a white chemise, the black habit visible on the floor beside her. Danny's eyes went wide. "Toby," he said slowly, "is that a woman in there?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "She is hurt. I am helping her. That is all." "Is that a nun?" Danny's voice rose an octave. "Holy hell, Toby, that is a nun." "Keep your voice down," Jacob said sharply. But Danny was already backing toward his horse. The way he looked at Jacob had changed. There was shock in his eyes and judgment. "Danny," Jacob said, "it is not what you think." But Danny was already mounting his horse. He kicked it into a gallop and disappeared down the trail, spraying snow. Jacob stood on the porch watching him go. He knew what would happen next. Danny would ride straight to town. He would tell his mother. His mother would tell the preacher's wife. And within hours, everyone in Timber Ridge would know that the hermit on the mountain had a nun in his cabin. Jacob went back inside. Rose was standing now, leaning against the wall for support. "He saw me," she said. Her face was pale. "Yes, they will come for me now, the whole town." Jacob closed the door and bolted it, then let them come. But deep in the valley below, the wheels were already turning. Danny Tucker rode into Timber Ridge at full gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. He went straight to his mother's house and told her what he had seen. Within an hour, the story had spread through the town like wildfire. The hermit Cordell had a nun up on his mountain, a bride of Christ. And she had been in his bed, wearing nothing but a shift, her hair down like a common woman. The scandal was delicious. The righteous were outraged. And in his office at the Archbishop's residence, Cornelius Thorne heard the news and smiled. He poured himself a glass of brandy and walked to the window. He could see the mountains from here, the white peaks rising against the gray sky. "So," he said softly, "Rose has found a protector." Beside him, a tall, thin man in a black coat stood with his hands behind his back. His name was Ezra Blackwood, and he had been a Pinkerton detective before Thorne hired him. He was very good at finding people who did not want to be found. "What are your orders, Your Excellency?" Ezra asked. Thorne took a sip of brandy. "Bring her back. Alive. I want her alive." "And the man?" Thorne's smile widened. "I do not care about the man. Do what you must." Ezra nodded. He walked to the desk and picked up a heavy revolver, a Colt Peacemaker with a 7.5-inch barrel. He checked the cylinder, spun it, and slid it into his holster. "I will have her back within 3 days," Ezra said. Thorne turned from the window. "Make it 2." Ezra Blackwood walked out into the cold morning, mounted his horse, and rode toward the mountain. Behind him, 4 other men followed. They were hard men, the kind who did not ask questions and did not leave witnesses. On the mountain, Jacob Cordell stood at his cabin door, looking out at the trees. He could not see them yet, but he knew they were coming. He looked back at Rose, who was sitting by the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She met his eyes, and he saw the fear there. But he also saw something else. Trust. She trusted him to protect her. And Jacob Cordell, who had not protected anyone in 11 years, who had let his wife and son while he watched helplessly, made a silent vow. He would not fail again. Whatever was coming, whatever darkness Archbishop Thorne would send, Jacob would stand against it. He would fight. And if necessary, he would die. But Rose would live. The first part of their story was ending. The cabin was warm. The fire crackled. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering their tracks, hiding them from the world. For now, they were safe. But the hunters were coming, and when they arrived, blood would be spilled on the white snow of Eagle's Crest. The snow fell for 3 more days, and in those 3 days, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was only the fire, the smell of pine smoke, and the strange new rhythm of 2 people learning to share a space that had been occupied by loneliness for so long. Rose's leg healed slowly. The stitches held, the infection retreated, and color returned to her face. On the morning of the 4th day, she insisted on helping with the chores despite Jacob's protests. "You should be resting," he said, watching her limp toward the woodpile. "I have rested enough." Rose picked up a split log and carried it to the box beside the hearth. "I am a sister of charity, Mr. Cordell. We are not accustomed to idleness." "Jacob, just Jacob." She turned to look at him. Her red hair was tied back with a strip of cloth, and she had mended her habit as best she could with needle and thread. The black dress still bore the marks of her ordeal, torn at the shoulder, stained with blood and mud, but she wore it with a dignity that made Jacob's chest tighten. "Very well, just Jacob." Over the following days, Jacob began to teach Rose the skills she would need to survive on the mountain. He showed her how to load and fire the Colt revolver, standing behind her in the snow as she aimed at a row of tin cans set on a fallen log. "Thumb back the hammer," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Aim for the center. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull." The gun bucked in her hand. The can flew backward. A hole punched clean through its center. "Good," Jacob said. "Again." By the 5th shot, Rose had hit 3 of the 6 cans. Jacob nodded his approval. "Good enough to scare them," he said. "Maybe good enough to stop them." Stop who? Whoever comes. Rose lowered the gun. Her hand was trembling, not from the recoil, but from the weight of what Jacob was saying. You think they will come. I know they will come. That afternoon, an old man arrived at the cabin. He was 68 years old, with white hair and a beard that reached his chest. He rode a mule and carried a shotgun across his saddle. His name was Samuel Cordell, and he was Jacob's father. Boy, Sam called out as he dismounted. You gonna invite your old man in, or do I freeze out here? Jacob opened the door. Pa, what brings you down? Heard some talk in town. Sam stomping the snow from his boots. Thought I'd come see for myself. He stepped inside and stepped bait when he saw Rose. She was standing by the fire, still wearing her habit, her hands clasped in front of her. Sam looked from her to Jacob and back again. So it is true, Sam said slowly. You got a nun up here. This is Sister Rose, Jacob said. She was hurt. I am helping her. Sam studied Rose for a long moment. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. The torn habit, the healing bruises, the way she stood ready to flee. Ma'am, Sam said, removing his hat. Samuel Cordell. I raised this fool boy. Tried to teach him some sense, but it never took. Rose's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. He has been very kind to me, Mr. Cordell. Call me Sam. And kindness is all well and good, but the town's buzzing like a kicked hornet nest. They say you ran from the Archbishop. They say Toby here kidnapped you. I kidnapped no one, Jacob said sharply. I know that, boy. But what you know and what folks believe are two different things. Sam sat down heavily in one of the chairs. Archbishop Thorns got the whole town stirred up. Says Sister Rose here stole a gold chalice from the church. Says she's mentally unstable. Says you're holding her against her will. That is a lie, Rose said, her voice steady. All of it. I believe you, ma'am. But belief don't change what's coming. Sam looked at Jacob. Sheriff Burns is organizing a posse. They'll be up here within the week. Let them come, Jacob said. Sam shook his head. You stubborn fool. You can't fight the whole town. Then what would you have me do? Send her back? To that? Jacob gestured toward Rose, his voice rising. You know what they did to her, Pa. You can see it on her face. You want me to send her back so they can finish the job? No, Sam said quietly. I want you to be smart about it. You can't win this with guns. Then how do we win it? Before Sam could answer, Rose spoke. There is a way. Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. The Crimson Ledger. If we can get it, we can prove what Thorn is. What he has done. Where is this ledger? Sam asked. Hidden in St. Vincent's orphanage. Rose stepped forward. In the chapel, behind the altar. There is a false panel in the stone. Thorn thinks no one knows about it, but I found it 2 months ago. Jacob looked at her. You want to go back there? Not me. You. Rose met his eyes. You and someone who can document what we find. A witness. Someone people will believe. Sam stroked his beard. A journalist, maybe. Someone from outside the territory. Someone Thorn can't buy. Before anyone could respond, they heard the sound of a horse outside. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. A lone rider was approaching, leading his horse on foot through the deep snow. He wore city clothes ill-suited for the mountain and carried a leather satchel. Jacob opened the door cautiously, rifle ready. I might know someone, the stranger said, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. All three of them turned. A man stood in the open door, snow dusting his shoulders. He was perhaps 40 years old, wearing a wool suit and a derby hat. He carried a leather satchel and a box camera. William Morrison, the man said, stepping inside. Denver Post. And I have been looking for Sister Rose Sullivan for 2 weeks. Jacob's hand moved to his gun. How did you find us? I followed the sheriff's men. They are camped about 2 miles down the mountain, waiting for reinforcements. Morrison closed the door behind him. But I am not with them. I am here because my sister died in Archbishop Thorn's care, and I think Sister Rose might know why. Rose's face went pale. Your sister. What was her name? Catherine. Sister Catherine Morrison. She was at St. Vincent's 3 years ago. The official report said she fell down the stairs. But Kathy was 26 years old and healthy as a horse. She did not fall. Morrison opened his satchel and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He spread them on the table. There were photographs of 6 young women, all dressed in the black habits of nuns. There were death certificates, accident, suicide, natural causes. 6 sisters, Morrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. 6 young women, all dead within 4 years, all in Thorne's diocese. That is not coincidence. That is pattern. Rose stepped closer, looking at the photographs. Her hand went to her mouth. I knew 3 of them, she whispered. Sister Catherine, Sister Anne, Sister Michaela. They were all at St. Vincent's. They all opposed Thorne. Did they know about the ledger? I do not know, maybe. Rose looked up at Morrison, her eyes fierce. But I know where it is, and I can tell you what is in it. The 5 of them spent the next hour planning. Morrison had connections in the federal government. If he could get proof of Thorne's crimes, he could bypass the local corrupt system and go straight to the U.S. Marshal in Helena. But they needed the ledger, or at least they needed evidence that could not be disputed. I can get into St. Vincent's, Jacob said. I know the territory. I can move at night. You will need me, Morrison said. Someone has to photograph the ledger. Written testimony can be dismissed. But photographs? Those are harder to argue with. When do we go? Jacob asked. Tonight, Morrison stood. The sheriff's men are drinking themselves stupid down in their camp. They will not move until morning. We go tonight, get the ledger, and be gone before dawn. And if you are caught, Sam asked. Then we die, Jacob said simply. But at least Rose and the children will have a chance. From my Timon, Rose reached out and caught Jacob's arm. Be careful, she said softly. Jacob looked down at her hand on his sleeve. It was the first time she had touched him voluntarily since that first terrible night. Her fingers were small and pale against the dark leather of his coat. I will, he said. That night, Jacob and Morrison set out. They traveled on foot, moving silently through the forest. The moon was full, casting silver light across the snow. They could see the lights of St. Vincent's orphanage in the valley below, a large stone building with a chapel attached. They approached from the north, staying in the tree line. 2 guards patrolled the grounds, but they were cold and inattentive, more interested in staying near the fire than watching the shadows. Jacob and Morrison waited until the guards changed shift at 2 in the morning. Then they moved. Jacob picked the lock on the chapel window with a piece of wire. It took him 3 minutes, his fingers numb with cold. The window swung open silently, and they climbed inside. The chapel was dark and cold. Moonlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in colors, red and blue and gold. The altar stood at the far end, a simple wooden table covered with a white cloth. There, Rose had said, behind the altar. The false panel is on the right side, 3rd stone from the bottom. Jacob and Morrison moved to the altar. Jacob knelt and ran his hands over the stone wall. He found the panel, pressed the hidden catch, and it swung inward with a soft click. Inside was a small cavity, and inside the cavity was a leather-bound book. Jacob pulled it out. The cover was deep crimson, the color of old blood. He opened it to the first page. The writing was neat, precise, meticulous. It was a record of every crime Cornelius Thorne had committed over 10 years. The stolen money, the bribes, the names of officials on his payroll, and worst of all, the notes about the sisters who had died. Sister Anne, drowned in the creek. $50 to Ezra Blackwood for services rendered. Sister Catherine, fall from bell tower. $75. Body disposed of in the ravine behind the north pasture. Morrison set up his camera with shaking hands. He opened the ledger to the most damning pages and began to photograph them. The flash powder ignited with a bright white light that filled the chapel. And then the lights came on. Sheriff Burns stepped out from behind a pillar, his gun drawn. 6 deputies materialized from the shadows, all armed. "Drop your weapons," Burns said. His voice echoed in the stone chamber. Jacob and Morrison were surrounded. Jacob's hand moved toward his Colt, but Morrison grabbed his arm. "Do not," Morrison hissed. "They will kill us both." Slowly, Jacob raised his hands. Morrison did the same. Burns walked forward, his boots clicking on the stone floor. "Well, well, the hermit and the journalist. Archbishop Thorne said you would come." "This was a trap," Jacob said. "Of course it was." Burns smiled. "You think Mother Beatrice told Sister Rose about the ledger by accident?" The Archbishop has been planning this for weeks. He wanted Rose to run. He wanted someone to hide her. And then he wanted that someone to come here so he could catch them in the act of breaking and entering. From the doorway behind the altar, another figure appeared. It was Mother Beatrice, the abbess of St. Vincent's. Her face was wet with tears. "Forgive me," she whispered. "He threatened to close the orphanage, to throw the children into the streets. I had no choice." Rose had trusted her, and Beatrice had betrayed that trust. Jacob felt rage rising in his chest, hot and choking. But beneath it was something colder. Fear. They had been outmaneuvered. Thorne had known every step they would take. "Take them," Burns said. The deputies moved forward. They grabbed Jacob and Morrison, wrenching their arms behind their backs. One of them picked up the ledger. But Morrison had been faster than they knew. In the moment before the lights came on, he had taken 4 photographs. And the glass plate negatives were still in his camera case, hidden beneath a false bottom. The deputies dragged them toward the door. As they passed through the chapel, Jacob saw a face at one of the windows. A small face, pale and frightened. Lucy, the 12-year-old girl Rose had told him about. She was watching from the dormitory window, her hands pressed against the glass. Jacob tried to memorize her face. If he died tonight, at least he would know what Rose had been fighting for. They were taken outside and thrown onto horses. The deputies tied their hands and led them down the mountain trail. But instead of taking them to the jail in Timber Ridge, they turned east toward the high country. "Where are you taking us?" Morrison demanded. Burns did not answer. He just smiled. They rode for 2 hours, climbing higher into the mountains. Finally, they stopped at a place called Devil's Gut, a narrow ravine with sheer rock walls on both sides. The wind howled through it like the breath of something angry and alive. The deputies dismounted and pulled Jacob and Morrison from their horses. They threw them to the ground, and then Ezra Blackwood appeared. He walked down the ravine like he owned it, his black coat flapping in the wind. Behind him came 4 more men, all carrying rifles, and behind them, dressed in a heavy fur coat and riding a white horse, came Archbishop Cornelius Thorne. Thorne dismounted slowly. He was a handsome man, perhaps 55 years old, with silver hair and pale blue eyes. He wore his archbishop's pectoral cross over his coat, a large golden crucifix that caught the moonlight. "Mr. Cordell," Thorne said, his voice smooth and cultured, "we finally meet." Jacob said nothing. He stared at the man who had tortured Rose, who had killed 6 women, who hid his evil behind a collar and a cross. "I must thank you," Thorne continued. "You have been most helpful. By harboring Sister Rose, you have given me the perfect excuse to eliminate her. She will be returned to my care, of course. And you will have an unfortunate accident in these mountains. A fall, perhaps. The terrain is quite treacherous." "You will not touch her," Jacob said. Thorne laughed. "My dear man, I already have touched her. Many times. And I will touch her again. As often as I like. Because she is mine. She was always meant to be mine." Jacob lunged forward, but the deputies grabbed him and slammed him back to the ground. He tasted blood. "Take them to the edge," Thorne said, gesturing toward the ravine. "Make it look like they fell." The deputies hauled Jacob and Morrison to their feet and began dragging them toward the cliff edge. The drop was 200 feet to jagged rocks below. This was it. This was how it would end. But then Morrison spoke. His voice was calm, almost cheerful. "Your Excellency, before you kill us, you might want to know something." Thorne paused. "What?" "I already sent the photographs to Denver, before we came here. My editor has them. Even now they are being developed, and by tomorrow morning, they will be on the desk of the U.S. Marshal." Thorne's face went white. "You are lying." "Am I?" Morrison smiled. "Search my bag. You will find the camera, but you will not find the glass plates, because they are already gone." Ezra grabbed Morrison's satchel and tore it open. He dumped the contents on the ground. The camera was there, but the case where the plates should have been was empty. Thorne's hand trembled as he reached for the satchel. He ripped it apart, searching every pocket, every seam. Nothing. "Where are they?" Thorne's voice rose to a shout. "Where are they?" "Safe," Morrison said. "And by tomorrow, every newspaper in the territory will know what you are." Thorne's face twisted with rage. "Then you die now," he hissed. He drew a pistol from beneath his coat and pointed it at Morrison's head. But before he could pull the trigger, A gunshot rang out. One of the deputies fell, clutching his leg. Everyone spun around. On the ridge above them, silhouetted against the moon, stood three figures. One was holding a rifle. The smoke from the barrel drifted away on the wind. It was old Sam, and beside him were Father Patrick O'Brien, the priest from Timber Ridge, and Rose. Rose stood there in her torn habit, her red hair whipping in the wind, holding Jacob's Winchester rifle. "Let them go, Thorne," she called down, "or the next shot goes through your heart." Thorne stared up at her, his face a mask of fury. "You would not dare." Rose worked the lever action, chambering another round. The sound echoed through the ravine. "Try me." For a long moment no one moved. The wind howled. The moon shone down on the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Then Father O'Brien stepped forward. He was holding a Bible in one hand and a letter in the other. "Archbishop Thorne," O'Brien called out, his Irish accent thick with emotion. "I have here a letter from Cardinal Gibbons in Baltimore. He has been informed of your crimes. A delegation from Rome is on its way. You are finished." Thorne's gun hand wavered. His face went from red to white to gray. Everything he had built, everything he had controlled, was crumbling around him. "Shoot them!" he screamed at his men. "Shoot them all!" But the men did not move. They were hard men, yes, but they were not stupid. A dead archbishop was one thing. A dead priest and a nun were something else entirely. One by one, they lowered their guns. Thorne stood alone, his pistol shaking in his hand. He looked from Jacob to Rose to the deputies who had abandoned him. "This is not over," he said. "Yes," Jacob said, standing slowly. "It is." Thorne's eyes blazed with hatred. He raised the gun toward Rose one more time, and Rose pulled the trigger. The shot took Thorne in the shoulder. He spun around and fell, the gun flying from his hand. He landed hard on the rocky ground, screaming. The deputies rushed to him. Ezra Blackwood stood frozen, staring at Rose with something like respect in his cold eyes. Sheriff Burns looked at the chaos around him and made his decision. He walked over to Thorne and pulled out a pair of iron shackles. "Cornelius Thorne," Burns said, his voice flat, "I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, embezzlement, and murder." "You cannot do this," Thorne gasped through his pain. "I am an archbishop. I am above the law." "No one is above the law," Father O'Brien said, walking down into the ravine. "Not even you." Rose lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Jacob ran to her and caught her before she fell. "You came," he said. "Of course I came." Rose looked up at him, her green eyes bright with tears. "You saved my life. I could not let you die for me." Sam walked over, grinning. "That was some fine shooting, girl, for a bride of Christ." Rose looked down at the rifle in her hands. Then she looked at the archbishop writhing on the ground. "I shot a man," she whispered. "I broke my vows. I committed violence." "You saved lives," Jacob said firmly. "Mine. Morrison's. That is not a sin. That is justice." But the weight of what she had done settled over Rose like a heavy cloak. She had taken vows of peace, and now she had shot a man, even if only to wound him. "What have I become?" she asked. "A woman," Jacob said, "a strong, brave woman." The deputies took Thorne away, loading him onto a horse. He would be taken to the federal jail in Helena to await trial. Burns went with them, his face grim. He knew his own crimes would come to light. He knew he would not be sheriff much longer. Morrison retrieved his camera and opened it carefully. He pressed a hidden catch on the bottom of the case, and a false panel popped open. Inside lay 4 glass plate negatives, each one capturing a page of the Crimson Ledger in perfect detail. "I lied to Thorne," Morrison said, his voice tight with satisfaction. "Told him they were already sent to Denver, but I kept them with me. Couldn't risk losing them in transit." He held up one of the plates to the moonlight. Even in the dim silver glow, the handwriting on the negative was clearly visible. "These 4 images will hang him. I will personally deliver them to the U.S. Marshal in Helena tomorrow." Father O'Brien put a hand on Rose's shoulder. "Come, child. You need rest. The church will take care of you now." But Rose pulled away. She looked at Jacob. "I cannot go back," she said. "Not yet." The moon was setting as they made their way back to the cabin. Rose rode behind Jacob on his horse, her arms around his waist, her head resting against his back. She was exhausted, physically and spiritually. When they reached the cabin, Sam and Father O'Brien said their goodbyes and left. The priest promised to come back in a few days to check on them. Inside, Jacob built up the fire while Rose sat at the table, staring at her hands. They were still shaking. "I have never hurt anyone before," she said quietly. "You did what you had to do," Jacob replied. "You did what was right. But my vows—" "Rose," Jacob interrupted. He knelt beside her chair so he could look into her eyes. "You are a good woman, a holy woman. God knows your heart. He knows you did not act from hate, but from love, from protection. How can you be so sure?" "Because I see you," Jacob's voice was rough with emotion. "I see the way you care for others, the way you talk about Lucy, the way you mended your own habit even though it hurt. You are not capable of true violence. What you did tonight was courage." Rose looked at him for a long moment. Then, without thinking, without planning, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief kiss, barely more than a touch, but it burned like fire. Rose pulled back immediately, her eyes wide with shock. "I am sorry," she gasped. "I should not have. I am a nun. I took vows of chastity. I cannot—" She stood up quickly, knocking over the chair. She backed away from him, her hand over her mouth. "I need to pray," she said. She turned and fled into the small back room, shutting the door behind her. Jacob sat on the floor where he had knelt, his heart pounding. He raised his hand to his lips, still feeling the ghost of her kiss there. For the first time in 11 years, Jacob Cordell allowed himself to feel something other than grief. He allowed himself to feel hope, and it terrified him. In the back room, Rose knelt before the small crucifix she had carried with her. She folded her hands and tried to pray, but the words would not come. All she could think about was Jacob, the way he had protected her, the way he had believed her, the way his eyes looked when he knelt beside her chair, and the way his lips had felt against hers. "Forgive me, Father," she whispered. "I have broken my vows. I have sinned." But even as she said it, she knew something had changed. The walls she had built around her heart, the walls of her calling, her identity as Sister Margaret Rose, were beginning to crack, and she did not know if she wanted to repair them. Outside, the snow began to fall again. The mountains were silent, and in that silence, two people sat on opposite sides of a door, both wrestling with the same impossible question. What happens when duty and desire collide? When vows and love stand in opposition? Neither of them had an answer, but they both knew that whatever came next would change everything. The second part of their story was ending. Thorne was arrested. The ledger would be used as evidence. Rose and Jacob were safe. But the hardest test was yet to come. Because loving a nun was one thing, but a nun loving you back? That was a burden heavy enough to break a man's soul. And Jacob Cordell would soon discover just how heavy that burden could be. The dawn after the confrontation at Devil's Gut came cold and clear. Jacob woke on the floor beside the dying fire, his body aching from sleeping on hard wood. He had not gone to bed. He had stayed awake, listening to Rose pray in the other room, listening to her cry softly when she thought he could not hear. When morning light filtered through the window, Jacob stood and stretched. His shoulder throbbed where a deputy had struck him with a rifle butt. His hands were scraped raw from the rocks. But he was alive. They were both alive. He built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. He was frying bacon when Rose emerged from the back room. She had changed from her torn habit into the simple dress Jacob had given her, one that had belonged to Martha. It was plain brown wool, too large for her small frame, but she had cinched it at the waist with a rope belt. Her hair was braided and pinned up. She looked tired, her eyes red from crying and lack of sleep. But there was something different in the way she held herself, something harder, something broken and remade. "Good morning," Jacob said quietly. "Good morning." They ate breakfast in silence. The kiss hung between them like smoke, visible but untouchable. Neither of them knew how to speak of it. When they finished eating, Jacob cleared the plates. "Rose," he said carefully, "about last night, please." Rose held up her hand. "Do not." "I was overwrought. I was not thinking clearly. It meant nothing." Jacob felt something twist in his chest, but he nodded. "Right, I am a nun." Rose continued, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly as she folded the dishcloth. "I took perpetual vows before God. Chastity, poverty, obedience. Those vows do not end because I am on a mountain instead of in a convent. I understand. Do you? Rose looked at him. Her green eyes were fierce and sad at once. Because I am not sure I do anymore. Before Jacob could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. It was Father O'Brien riding at the head of a small group. With him were Sam Cordell, William Morrison, and someone Jacob did not recognize. A woman, perhaps 60 years old, riding side saddle on a gray mare. She wore a black habit and a white wimple. A nun. Jacob opened the door as they arrived. Father O'Brien dismounted and helped the older woman down from her horse. "Mr. Cordell," O'Brien said, "may we come in?" Jacob stepped aside. The group filed into the cabin, stamping snow from their boots. The older nun looked around the small space with sharp, intelligent eyes. Then her gaze found Rose. "Sister Margaret," the woman said. Her voice was soft but carried weight. "Thank God you are safe." Rose's face went pale. "Mother Beatrice." The abbess stepped forward, but Rose took a step back. "You betrayed me," Rose said. Her voice shook. "You told Thorne everything. You helped him trap Jacob and Mr. Morrison." Mother Beatrice's face crumpled. "I know, child, I know, and I will carry that sin to my grave." The older woman sank down onto one of the chairs, suddenly looking every one of her 65 years. "He threatened to close the orphanage, to turn out all the children. Lucy, Josephine, Michael, all of them. What was I to do? You were to protect us," Rose said. "You were our Mother Superior. We trusted you, and I failed you." Beatrice looked up, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I failed all of you, the 5 sisters who died, you. I chose institutional survival over moral courage, and I will spend the rest of my life atoning for it." Father O'Brien placed a hand on Rose's shoulder. "She has come to make amends, child, and to bring you news." "What news?" Morrison stepped forward. He carried his leather satchel and set it on the table. "The photographs I took," he said, "they have been seen by the U.S. Marshal. Thorne has been formally charged with embezzlement, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. The bodies of 3 of the missing sisters have been found where the ledger said they would be. He will hang." Rose closed her eyes. "Thank God." "But there is more," O'Brien said. He pulled a letter from his coat. "This arrived yesterday from Cardinal Gibbons in Baltimore. The Vatican has been informed of everything. They are sending investigators, and they have made a decision about you, Sister Rose." O'Brien handed her the letter. Rose took it with shaking hands and read. When she finished, she looked up, her face unreadable. "They are offering me a choice," she said quietly. "What choice?" Jacob asked. He had been standing by the door, silent until now. Rose looked at him. "They say I may return to religious life. I would be transferred to a different diocese, away from Thorne's influence. I would continue my vows as if nothing had happened. Or," she paused, "or I may request a dispensation. A release from my vows. It would take 6 months to process, but the cardinal has indicated he would approve it given the extraordinary circumstances." Jacob felt his heart begin to pound. A dispensation. That meant Rose could leave the order. She could marry. She could have a normal life. She could choose him. But looking at her face, he could not tell what she was thinking. "I need time," Rose said. "Time to pray. Time to understand what God is asking of me." "Of course," O'Brien said. "Take all the time you need." But Mother Beatrice shook her head. "I am afraid time is something we do not have much of." "What do you mean?" "The children," Beatrice said. "Lucy especially. Without you there, without the medicines you were bringing, she has gotten worse. Much worse. She is coughing blood. She is asking for you, Rose. She thinks you abandoned her because she was bad." Rose's hand went to her mouth. "No, oh no, we need you to come back," Beatrice said. "Just for a time. Just to see the children settled. To say goodbye properly if you choose to leave." "It is a trap," Jacob said flatly. "Thorne may be in jail, but he has allies. Men who owe him money. Men who will want revenge. Which is why we will provide protection," Morrison said. "I have contacted the U.S. Marshal's office. They are sending deputies to guard St. Vincent's until Thorne's trial is complete. You will be safe." Jacob looked at Rose. "Do not go." Something in her gut was screaming danger. "Stay here. Let the marshal handle it." But Rose was already shaking her head. Lucy is dying. She is 12 years old and she thinks I abandoned her. She looked at Jacob, her eyes pleading for understanding. I have to go to her. She is the only child I will ever have. Then I go with you, Jacob said. No. Rose stepped toward him. You have done enough. You have risked your life for me too many times already. This is something I must do. Rose, please, Jacob. She reached out and touched his hand. It was the first time she had touched him since the kiss. Trust me, I will be careful, and I will come back. Jacob wanted to argue. He wanted to lock the door and refuse to let her leave, but he saw the determination in her eyes, and he knew that if he tried to stop her, he would lose her forever. All right, he said, but if you are not back in 3 days, I am coming for you. Rose smiled. It was a sad smile. 3 days. They left within the hour. Rose rode behind Father O'Brien on his horse. Mother Beatrice went with them, and so did Morrison, who wanted to document the reunion for his newspaper. Sam stayed behind to help Jacob with the trapline. Jacob stood on the porch and watched them ride away until they disappeared into the trees. He had a bad feeling about this, a feeling like cold water in his veins. Pa, he said to Sam, something is wrong. Sam nodded slowly. I feel it too, boy. But you can't cage that one. She's got a will like iron. If anything happens to her, then we'll burn the world down to get her back, Sam said. He clapped Jacob on the shoulder. Come on, let's check those traps. Keep your mind busy. But Jacob's mind would not be busy. All he could think about was Rose, the way she looked in the firelight, the way she had kissed him, the way she had pulled away. He was falling in love with a woman who belonged to Gung, and he did not know how that story could end in anything but heartbreak. Rose arrived at St. Vincent's Orphanage in the late afternoon. The stone building looked the same as it always had, gray and imposing, with its chapel spire reaching toward the clouded sky. But something felt different. The air felt heavier, wrong. The children were in the courtyard when she arrived, 24 of them, ranging in age from 5 to 15. When they saw Rose, they erupted in shouts and ran toward her. Mother Rose, you came back! Rose dismounted and was immediately surrounded by small bodies, hugging her, pulling at her dress, all talking at once. She laughed and cried at the same time, touching heads, squeezing hands, trying to speak to each of them. But one child was not in the courtyard. Where is Lucy? Rose asked Sister Margaret, one of the younger nuns. In the infirmary, Sister Margaret said quietly. She is very ill, Sister Rose. Dr. Patterson says it is only a matter of days now. Rose felt her heart drop. She hurried inside, climbing the stairs to the small room where the sick children were kept. Lucy was in the bed by the window, so thin she looked like a shadow. Her dark hair was lank and damp with sweat. Her breathing was labored, each breath a rattling struggle. Lucy, Rose whispered, kneeling beside the bed. Lucy's eyes opened. They were glassy with fever, but when she saw Rose, they cleared. Mother Rose, she croaked, is it really you? Yes, baby, I am here. Rose took Lucy's small hand in hers. I am so sorry I was gone. I thought... Lucy coughed, a wet, terrible sound. I thought you left because I was bad. No, no, sweetheart. Rose smoothed the damp hair from Lucy's forehead. You are good. You are so good. I left to get help, to stop the bad man who was hurting us. The Archbishop? Yes. Is he gone? He is gone. You are safe now. We are all safe. Lucy smiled. It was a weak smile, but it held joy. Then it was worth it. You being gone, if it made us safe. Rose felt tears running down her face. You rest now. I am going to stay right here. I am not leaving again. Promise, promise. Lucy's eyes drifted closed. Rose sat beside the bed and prayed. She prayed harder than she had ever prayed in her life. Not for herself, not for guidance about her vows or her future, but for this child, this little girl who had never known her real mother, who had been abandoned and forgotten by the world, but who had loved Rose with a pure and simple faith. Please, Rose whispered, not her. Take me if you must, but not her. The hours passed, night fell. One of the other sisters brought Rose soup, but she did not eat it. She just held Lucy's hand and prayed. Sometime after midnight, Lucy's breathing changed. It became shallower, faster. Rose knew what that meant. She had seen enough death in her 6 years at the orphanage. "Lucy," she said softly, "can you hear me?" Lucy's eyes opened one last time. "Yes," she whispered. "I love you. You know that, do not you? I love you too, Mother Rose." And then Lucy smiled. She looked past Rose at something Rose could not see. "She looks like you," Lucy said. "The lady. She has red hair like you. And the boy with her, he is holding a wooden horse." Rose felt ice run down her spine. "What?" "They say not to be afraid." Lucy's voice was fading. "They say you will be happy, and I will wait for you on the other side." Lucy took one more breath, and then she was still. Rose sat in the dark infirmary holding the hand of a dead child, and something inside her shattered. The faith she had clung to, the certainty that God had a plan, that suffering had meaning, all of it crumbled into dust. She had lost the only child she would ever have. The funeral was held 4 days later. The entire town came. Lucy had been loved by everyone who knew her, a bright spark of kindness in a hard world. They buried her in the small cemetery behind the chapel, under a pine tree. Father O'Brien said the prayers. Rose stood at the graveside, silent and dry-eyed. She had no tears left. She felt hollow, scraped clean of everything that had made her who she was. After the service, Mother Beatrice approached her. "Child," she said gently, "you should rest. You have not slept in days." "I do not need rest," Rose said. Her voice was flat, emotionless. "You are in shock. You are grieving. Please come inside." "No." Rose turned to look at the abbess. "I am going back to the mountain, back to Jacob." Beatrice's eyes widened. "Rose, you are not thinking clearly. You are a nun. You cannot." "I shot a man," Rose interrupted. "I kissed a man. I have broken every vow I took. And now the only person I loved like a daughter is dead. So tell me, Mother, what exactly am I now?" "You are still Sister Margaret Rose. You are still one of us." "No." Rose shook her head. "I am not. Not anymore." She walked away from the grave, away from the chapel, away from the life she had lived for the past 10 years. Rose spent the rest of that day in the orphanage chapel, kneeling before the altar where she had once felt God's presence so clearly. Now there was only emptiness. Father O'Brien found her there as evening fell. "Child, you should rest," he said gently. "I cannot rest, not here, not anymore." "Then let me arrange safe passage back to Jacob's cabin tomorrow. The marshal's men can escort you." But Rose shook her head. "I need to walk, to think, to pray one last time in this place." As twilight deepened, Rose slipped out the side door of the orphanage. She told no one where she was going. She simply walked, her feet carrying her toward the old mining road that led out of town. She needed solitude. She needed to say goodbye to Sister Margaret Rose before she could become just Rose. She made it half a mile down the empty road before she saw them. 5 men on horseback blocking the path. They were not deputies. They were not lawmen. They were hard-faced men with guns and cold eyes. The leader was Ezra Blackwood. "Sister Rose," Ezra said, his voice like gravel, "you are coming with us." Rose took a step back. "Thorne is in jail. You have no authority." Ezra smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "The Archbishop still has friends, powerful friends. They paid us well to finish what he started. What do you want?" "You," Ezra said, "dead. But first we are going to make sure the hermit watches." Before Rose could scream, before she could run, one of the men rode up behind her and grabbed her. He threw a sack over her head and lifted her onto his horse. She struggled, kicking and biting, but he was too strong. Within seconds, they were riding away, heading north into the mountains. Back at the orphanage, Sister Margaret found the note 20 minutes later. It was pinned to the gate with a knife. "We have the nun. If the hermit wants her, he can come to Widow's Peak. Alone tonight. If he brings the law, she dies." Sister Margaret ran to find Father O'Brien. The priest read the note, and his face went gray. "We have to tell Cordell," he said. "It is a trap," Morrison said. "They are going to kill them both. Then what do we do?" O'Brien looked at the note again, then at the mountains rising in the distance. "We pray," he said, "and we hope Jacob Cordell is as dangerous as people say." Jacob was splitting wood when Sam came running up the trail. The old man was out of breath, his face red with exertion. Boy, Sam gasped. They took her. Jacob's axe froze mid-swing. What? Rose. 5 men. They grabbed her from St. Vincent's, left a note. Want you to come to Widow's Peak. Alone. Jacob dropped the axe. He walked to the cabin and began loading weapons. His rifle, his revolver, his knife, a second pistol from the trunk under the bed. Sam watched him. You know it is a trap, I know. You go up there, you die. Jacob strapped on his gun belt. Then I die. He looked at his father. But I am not leaving her. Sam nodded slowly. Then I am coming with you. No, Pa, this is my fight. The hell it is. Sam picked up his shotgun. That girl came back for you at Devil's Gut. You think I am going to let you ride off to die without me? I am old, boy. I am 68 years old. If I die tonight, I die doing something that matters. Jacob looked at his father. He saw the determination in the old man's eyes, and he knew there was no point in arguing. All right, Jacob said, we ride together. They saddled their horses and rode north. The sun was setting, painting the snow gold and red. It would be dark in an hour. Widow's Peak was the highest point in the territory, a flat plateau of rocks surrounded by sheer cliffs. There was only one way up, a narrow trail that switched back up the mountain face. It was the perfect place for an ambush. As they rode, Sam spoke. You love her, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she is a nun. I know. Does not matter to you? Jacob was quiet for a moment. It matters, but not enough to change how I feel. And if she chooses God over you, then I will be happy she is alive to make that choice. Sam smiled. You are a better man than I was at your age. They reached the base of Widow's Peak as darkness fell. Jacob dismounted and studied the trail. It was narrow, barely wide enough for a horse. The rock walls on either side rose 50 feet straight up. They will be waiting at the taint, Jacob said. Rifles trained on the trail. The moment we step into the open, they will cut us down. So we do not take the trail, Sam said. Jacob looked at him. What? Sam pointed to the east face of the cliff. When I was young, I climbed that rock face. Took me 3 hours, but I made it. There is a ledge about halfway up, and from there you can traverse around to the back of the plateau. Jacob studied the cliff. It was nearly vertical, covered with ice. In daylight, it would be dangerous. In the dark, it would be suicide. But Rose was up there. Let us climb, Jacob said. They left the horses and began to ascend. The rock was slick with ice, and the wind tore at them, trying to rip them from the mountain. Jacob's fingers went numb within minutes. His boots slipped and skidded on the frozen stone. But he kept climbing. Sam was ahead of him, moving with the confidence of a man who had done this before. Twice Jacob almost fell, catching himself at the last second. His heart pounded, his lungs burned. After an hour, they reached the ledge Sam had mentioned. It was barely 3 feet wide, a thin shelf of rock that ran along the cliff face. They edged along it, their backs pressed to the stone, the drop below them invisible in the darkness. Finally, they reached the backside of the plateau. They pulled themselves over the edge and lay in the snow, gasping for breath. Jacob looked across the flat expanse of rock. About 100 yards away, he could see firelight and silhouettes moving around it. They had found the camp. Jacob and Sam moved silently across the plateau, staying low, using the scattered boulders for cover. As they got closer, Jacob could see the scene more clearly. 5 men sat around the fire. Ezra Blackwood stood apart, watching the trail below. And tied to a post driven into the rock was Rose. She was still wearing Martha's brown dress. Her hands were bound behind her back. Her face was bruised, and there was blood on her lip. But she was alive. Jacob felt rage burning in his chest, white-hot and pure. He wanted to charge into the camp and tear Ezra apart with his bare hands. But he forced himself to be calm, to think. He looked at Sam and gestured. Sam nodded. They split up, circling around opposite sides of the camp. Jacob moved like a ghost, silent and invisible. He had been an army scout for 5 years. He knew how to kill without being seen. The first man died without making a sound. Jacob came up behind him as he stood watch on the far side of the camp. Jacob's knife went into his kidney, then across his throat. The man crumpled. Jacob lowered him to the ground and took his rifle. The second man was smoking a cigarette by a boulder. Jacob shot him from 30 yards. The man fell backward, the cigarette still glowing in his mouth. The three remaining men scrambled for their weapons, shouting in confusion. Ezra spun around, his hand going to his pistol, and then Sam's shotgun roared from the other side of camp. One of the men flew backward, his chest opened by buckshot. Jacob stepped into the firelight, his rifle aimed at Ezra. The remaining man raised his hand slowly. "Let her go," Jacob said. Ezra looked at him, then at Sam, who had emerged from the shadows with the shotgun leveled, then at his dead companions. "You are making a mistake, Cordell," Ezra said. "No, the mistake was yours, thinking I would let you take her." Ezra's hand twitched toward his gun. Jacob fired. The bullet took Ezra in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell to one knee, gasping. The last man threw down his weapon and ran. He made it 10 feet before he slipped on the ice and tumbled over the edge of the plateau. His scream echoed for a long time. Jacob ran to Rose. He cut her bonds with his knife. She collapsed into his arms, sobbing. "You came," she gasped. "You came for me." "Always," Jacob said. He held her tight, his face pressed into her hair. "Always." Sam stood guard while Jacob carried Rose away from the camp. They made their way back down the mountain, using the trail this time. Ezra Blackwood lay on the plateau, bleeding into the snow. He would live, but his days of hunting people were over. When they reached the horses, Rose finally stopped shaking. She looked up at Jacob. "Lucy died," she said. Her voice was hollow. "I know, I'm so sorry. She was 12 years old. She never hurt anyone. And she died alone and afraid." "She was not alone," Jacob said gently. "You were with her, but I could not save her. Just like I could not save the other sisters. Just like I cannot save anyone. Rose, you saved me. You saved Morrison. You saved those children in the orphanage by exposing Thorne. You are the strongest person I know. I do not feel strong." Rose looked down at her hands. "I feel broken." "Then be broken," Jacob said. "It is all right to be broken. God does not love you less for it." "How do you know?" "Because I have been broken for 11 years, and you love me anyway." Rose looked up at him. Her eyes were red from crying, her face was bruised, and her dress was torn. But in that moment, Jacob thought she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "I cannot be a nun anymore," Rose said. "I do not know how to be a nun after everything that has happened." "Then do not be," Jacob said. "But if I leave the order, who am I? What am I?" "You are Rose. Just Rose, and that is enough. Is it? Is it enough for you?" Jacob cupped her face in his hands. "You are everything," he said. "You are everything I thought I would never have again. Hope, light, a reason to wake up in the morning." And then he kissed her. Not the brief, desperate kiss of before, but a real kiss, deep and tender and full of promise. Rose kissed him back. She wrapped her arms around his neck and held on like he was the only solid thing in a world that was spinning apart. When they finally pulled away, she was crying again. But this time the tears were different. "I love you," she whispered. "I do not know if that is right or wrong. I do not know if God will forgive me. But I love you." "Then that is enough," Jacob said. They rode back to the cabin in the darkness. Sam rode ahead, giving them space. Rose sat in front of Jacob on his horse, leaning back against his chest. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. When they reached the cabin, Father O'Brien and William Morrison were waiting. O'Brien had brought news from Baltimore. The cardinal had granted Rose's dispensation. She was released from her vows, effective immediately. She was free, free to marry, free to love, free to choose her own path. Rose read the letter 3 times, then she looked at Jacob. He was standing by the fire, watching her, waiting for her decision. "I choose you," she said simply. Jacob crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. Father O'Brien cleared his throat. "I can perform the ceremony," he said, "if you wish." "Now?" Rose asked. "Why wait?" Jacob said. He looked down at her. "Unless you need time." Rose thought about the last 10 years of her life, the convent, the vows, the children, Lucy's grave under the pine tree. All of it was behind her now. She was standing at the beginning of something new. "No," she said, "I do not need time." They were married in the cabin that night. It was a small ceremony. Sam served as witness. Morrison took photographs. Father O'Brien spoke the words that bound them together before God and man. Do you, Jacob, take Rose? I do. Do you, Rose, take Jacob? Rose looked at the man standing before her. The mountain man with the scarred face and gentle hands. The man who had saved her life. The man who had shown her that love could exist outside the walls of a convent. I do, O'Brien smiled. Then by the power vested in me by the church in the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob kissed his bride, and for the first time in 11 years, he felt whole. The story could have ended there, but there was one more chapter to tell. 6 months later, on a warm day in June, Rose stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out at the valley below. Her hand rested on her stomach where a child grew. Jacob's child. Their child. Behind her, Jacob was building a cradle from pine wood. He worked slowly, carefully, whittling each piece with the same patience he had used to whittle toys for Caleb so many years ago. Rose watched him and felt something she had not felt in a long time. Peace. She was no longer Sister Margaret Rose. She was just Rose Cordell, wife, soon-to-be mother, and she was happy. But she had not forgotten. She still wore the silver crucifix from her habit. She still prayed every morning and evening. She had not abandoned her faith. She had simply learned that God lived in more places than churches and convents. He lived in the mountain wind, in the smell of pine smoke, in the touch of a husband's hand, in the kick of a baby growing inside her. Old Sam had passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 months after the wedding, a smile on his weathered face. Jacob had found him in his cabin one morning, the shotgun still resting beside the bed, a half-finished letter to Jacob on the table. The letter said, "Boy, you finally learned to live again. I can rest now." They buried him on the ridge beside Martha and Caleb, under the pine trees he had planted as a young man. Jacob visited the grave every Sunday, bringing fresh venison and telling his father about the grandchild that would never know him. In the garden behind the cabin, she had planted wildflowers on a small grave marker. It read, "Lucy, beloved daughter, forever remembered." Every Sunday, Rose brought fresh flowers to that marker, and every Sunday she told the child in her womb about the little girl who had called her mother Rose, so that Lucy would not be forgotten. One evening, as the sun set over Eagle's Crest, Jacob found Rose sitting on the porch. She was reading a letter that had arrived that morning. "Good news?" he asked. Rose looked up and smiled. "It is from Mother Beatrice. St. Vincent's has been reformed. The Vatican sent new leadership. They are building a new dormitory for the children. And they want to name it after Lucy. That is good. And there is more." Rose's smile widened. William Morrison's articles about Thorne have been published nationwide. 3 other dioceses have open investigations into their own bishops. Thorne was hanged 2 months ago in the territorial prison. His last words were a curse against me, but I felt nothing. Only peace that it was over. And because of what we did, other women will be safe. Ezra Blackwood testified against Thorne in exchange for leniency. He is serving 15 years in the territorial prison. The judge said without his testimony, we might not have had enough evidence to convict Thorne of murder. Jacob sat down beside her. "You did that." "We did that," Rose corrected. "You and me and St. Anne, Father O'Brien. All of us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and red. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked, "leaving the convent?" Rose thought about it. She thought about the life she had given up, the black habit, the structured prayers, the certainty of a world divided into sacred and profane. "No," she said, "I do not regret it. I miss the children. I miss the work, but I do not miss the cage. Even if the cage was holy, especially if it was holy." Rose took Jacob's hand. "God did not put me on this earth to be caged. He put me here to love, to heal, to help. And I can do that anywhere, even here." "Especially here," Jacob said. Rose leaned her head on his shoulder. They sat that way until the stars came out, 2 people who had found each other in the darkness and built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their lives. In the cabin, the fire burned low. The cradle sat finished beside the bed, waiting for the child who would soon fill it. And on the mantel, next to the photograph of Martha and Caleb, sat a new photograph. It showed a man and a woman standing in front of a cabin. The man was tall and bearded, wearing buckskins and holding a rifle. The woman wore a simple dress and smiled at the camera, one hand resting on her husband's arm. They looked happy, and they were. 10 years later, when Jacob was 53 and Rose was 39, their granddaughter would ask them to tell the story of how they met. And Rose would smile and say, "I was dying in the snow, and your grandfather saved my life." And Jacob would add, "No, she saved mine." And they would both be telling the truth. Because salvation does not always come from heaven. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places, from a mountain, from a stranger, from a love that defies every rule and expectation, from a forbidden sanctuary that became a home. The story of Jacob and Rose Cordell became legend in the Montana Territory. People told it in taverns and around campfires. They told it to their children and their grandchildren. Some said it was a scandal, others said it was a romance, but everyone agreed on one thing. It was a story about finding grace in the wilderness, about two broken people who became whole, about a nun who learned that loving God did not mean abandoning love itself, and about a mountain man who learned that the heart he thought was dead could beat again. That is the end of their story, but it is not the end of love, because love, real love, never truly ends. It just changes form, from vows to rings, from habit to wedding dress, from sister to wife, from solitude to family. And in the end, is that not what we all seek? To be transformed by love, to be made new, to find in another person the missing piece of ourselves we did not even know was lost. Jacob and Rose found that, in the worst circumstances, against all odds, despite every obstacle that faith and society and fate could throw at them, they found each other. And that, more than any miracle, is enough. The end.